thank you so much for choosing to spend a part of your day with us in conjunction with the Graduate School, Postdoctoral Services, and the Career Center. We welcome you and appreciate your coming. Today you will be in for a real treat with Dr. Mohamed Noor, who is a professor and associate chair of biology, and he will be talking today on the research statement in the application series. All of the academic series have been recorded thanks to David Steinbrenner. And if you are interested, if you missed any of the previous sessions, if you go to postdoc.duke.edu, you can see any of those programs there. Or if you need a refresher, you can go back and look at those. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Dr. Noor, and thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely, thanks for inviting me. Before I start, just you can actually put all your pens down except for 1 second to write this. This is the link that has every slide I'm going to show you in this presentation, so you don't have to copy anything I write down at all. I'll give you a second just to write that down, and then I'll switch over to the talk. All right, we'll come up again at the end in case somebody shows up late. So this is very much intended to be an informal talk, so please stop me anytime. I'll actually walk around too to make it very obvious it's informal. I won't bother you. But the whole objective, as you know from the whole series, is to help you get in the long term a position that you're interested in. And this one in particular is going to be focusing on research-oriented faculty positions. So with these, obviously one of the parts of your job application will be submitting this research statement. But I'll talk a little bit more generally about the job application process and how these are evaluated as they're coming in. So here's an outline of what I'll be presenting to you today. First, just the context of what's happening. Again, what's happening in the context of this sort of job search and how they're evaluating your package. The structure of a research statement itself, though, let me emphasize, there's no dogma here. There's no, you must do it this way. It's going to be largely up to you, and you may come up with a creative solution that's very different from some of the ideas I'll present to you. And I'd encourage you to use your creativity a little bit on that as well. Selling yourself is probably the part I'll spend the least amount of time on, but it is the most important thing. And the last one is questions to ask yourself. Basically, when you're done with your research statement, go through that list of questions and ask yourself, does it meet all these different things? These are the kinds of things that the evaluators will be looking for in that context. But very importantly, interrupt me at any time with lots and lots of questions, okay? Everybody good? All right. So what's at stake? This picture over here I found on the internet illustrates it pretty well. For a typical assistant professor in biology, this is my field, I know not everybody here is necessarily a biologist, you may have between 50 and 500 applications coming in. Right? So you have one person at the end is actually going to get that job, but there's 50 to 500 applications out there that people are be sifting through. Now that range is pretty big there. You may think, well, 50 is not that bad. 2% chance. Pretty big. 500 is not so good. Part of it's going to vary by the breadth of the ad. If the ad is for ecologists, that's a pretty broad ad. In contrast, if it's a quantitative ecology of marine diatoms, that's going to be very narrow. That one may get even less than 50 in that case. The other thing is it'll be variable by how appealing the location is. Honestly, it's a little bit sad to say, but when I was on the faculty at Louisiana State University, the application numbers tended to be lower than the numbers I've seen here, just because fewer people are interested in living in the very deep South. So depending on how appealing a place it is and how appealing the university is, you'll get more applications. So, and of course, everybody wants to go to their first choice, so there'll be more going up there. From those 50 to 500, we expect 3 to 6 to be interviewed for any particular position. The 6 is usually if they're actually hiring 2 people. They don't usually interview 6 for 1. And then at the end, you have 1 person with a happy face there at the end who gets the job. There actually may be 2 because the first person may actually decline it and may go to the second one. So you may go down a little bit further than that. So what's in your job application? Some of this may have already come up in the other segments you guys have been talking about. Obviously, your CV is of paramount importance, and this is what's going to be used in that first pass, which I'll come back to in just a second. But obviously, this is presenting what publications you've had, any sort of grant support that you've gotten for your research, your teaching experience, all these kinds of things will be presented in a very abbreviated format. You have a cover letter, which is very important in there. You have just a page or 2 outlining what's going on. Your research statement, which is the focus of today's talk. Your teaching statement, which I think was the previous talk that you all saw. Potentially you might be sending in your PDFs of your publications. Sometimes they don't bother, because they're like, they can look it up themselves too. And of course, letters of reference. And those are obviously extremely important, as you can imagine. Now, keeping in mind who's reading these things, right? So you have a search committee of 3 to 6 overworked faculty members, or at least they perceive themselves to be overworked, right? You may have one graduate student too who's on the search committee. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And they're probably all looking over these at the last minute. There's a faculty meeting set up for October 26th to look at all these applications. Probably October 24th to 25th is when the vast majority of work is being done. It's probably not being done October 20th of this, big rush to do it at the last second. And again, keeping in mind, there may be 50 to 500 of these applications, right? So they'll be sifting through these pretty big. Usually what they do, and they have big numbers, especially like in the hundreds, they'll usually assign 1 or 2 people. You get A through H, you get I through L, you get M through O, things like that. And they basically sift through and just throw out the ones that don't even have a chance, quote unquote, don't even have a chance. Now people who don't even have a chance may be very qualified, but what's happening there is they're going to do the quick pass there to look at, is the subject area appropriate? Has this person published anything or above what we would consider to be a bare minimum sort of thing? And they'll basically cull it down to maybe around 50 that everybody will look at. It's sort of a typical approach. So, yeah?
What happens if the app is saying like, okay, we are taking it on November 15th, but they say like keep searching until the position is filled?
That's a very good question. So often they'll have a deadline where it says, but consideration will continue until the position is filled. What'll happen then is they'll usually assess on the deadline date how many applications they have. So if they're due November 15th, they'll probably have a faculty meeting set for the 22nd, but the search committee will assess on, say, November 18th or 20th or something like that. Do we have enough here that looks like it's okay to move forward? If they do move forward, they'll probably just go ahead and start saying, okay, let's go ahead and generate a short list, things like that. If an application comes after that, they may still consider it. If it comes after they've already invited people to interview, usually at that point they'll just say, we'll set this aside. If the whole thing fails, maybe we'll come back to it. Unless it's somebody who's just really crazy over the top. But that obviously doesn't happen that often. So that's a very good question. Anyway, they try to get it down to about 50 that everybody will look through. Basically, the top tier ones. But again, the amount of time being spent on this is probably about 1 minute or less if the CV is considered unsatisfactory or if the area is not appropriate. And probably less than 10 minutes on both the first and second pass. I mean, there's just by the sheer numbers, you can't spend, if there's 500 applications, you spend 10 minutes time, that's a lot of time. You can't do that. So this is something to really keep in mind in the context of formatting, in the context of highlighting what's really important in your stuff. So keep that in mind. There we go. So to succeed, what has to happen, right? Obviously, your application has to make the first cut, right? If you're in the H through M pile, you have to be the one that got pulled out by that one committee member. And then the rest of the search committee has to get excited about that second cut, right? When you have let's say you made it to that group of 50, everybody has to say, ooh, this is really good. And we'll talk about what really good means in just a second. And ultimately, you have to pass a full department vote, right? That after a search committee makes a recommendation, typically they take this to the department will vote. Sometimes they will not accept what the search committee says. Usually they do, but sometimes somebody from another area will say, I couldn't understand what this person wrote at all. I can't imagine they'd be a good teacher, or this doesn't seem like this is a topic that's very fundable. Something will come up from somebody else who's not necessarily on the search committee. So again, you have to really appeal to a broad cross-section. This cross-section includes specialists and generalists, right? There'll be people who may be right in your area, and there'll be people who will be nowhere near your area. So for example, if you're a biochemist, there'll be ecologists who will at least be flipping through it and trying to get some idea. They probably won't be on the search committee, but maybe they will. Depends on what's going on. They also have to be optimistic about their prospects. Like, will this person be successful? That's basically what you're trying to get across there, that I will be successful both in general and if hired at X place. You notice in that latter part, you're going to have to tailor these applications a little bit based on where you're applying. If you're applying for a job here and you're applying for where I went to college, at the College of William and Mary, you can't use exactly the same application. It's not going to work. And that includes even for the research statement too. So let's talk about the structure of that. Any questions first before I move on? That was a good first question. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's like, should I ask it now, but they usually have an email so that you can communicate with the search community committee. Something ask them like, what classes do you want them to take, and for research statement, apparently you want to get some idea like how specific that is. But how important is it to communicate with the committee before you even apply?
I think so. The question was how important is it to communicate with the search committee before you apply? I think if you have some specific questions, I would go ahead and do it because it's not going to work against you. If it's just to feel it out, I wouldn't bother. I mean, unless you have something like you're really trying to understand some particular thing about the ad or some particular thing about the search. Let's say, for example, it's a search that specifies junior level, but you're an associate professor and you want to know if you could be considered with tenure there. That would be an ad that would be totally appropriate to email and ask them or something like that. If it's something more specific, like about what classes you would teach there, I'd probably just hold off. I mean, you go based on what the ad says. I probably wouldn't ask them to say what classes would I teach there or something like that.
And also, how important is it for the research statement to tie into the strategic goal to the university?
So we'll come back to that.
Okay.
That's a good question. I'll come back to that in just a minute. All right, so what's going in this research statement? So these are the basic pieces right there. And we'll talk about them in much more detail, obviously, in just a second. Your ingredients here. You have to have some sort of executive summary or overview. And usually it starts with that. So, basically, what is your field? What is it you've been trying to do in this field? And how are you strategizing it? You have your past or completed research, which is often going to be your PhD research. And you have your in-progress research, which is often your postdoctoral research. I'm being specific here for the sciences. I apologize for anybody who's not in the sciences. And then obviously your future and planned research. One thing people often say, well, I don't want to put something down there because I may not want to do that. This isn't a contract. Nobody's going to come back to you 4 years later and say, you said in your research statement, your job application, you're going to Nobody's going to remember that. That's why the ancient history. Basically, if you show up and you're successful, they're not going to care as long as it's in the basic field you said you were hired for. You can't switch from a biologist to an economist or something like that. So, what's the structure like? So this just tells you some ideas of things, the kinds of skills you may apply in doing it. It's not necessarily that it's identical to these things. It's kind of similar to a grant proposal in some ways, right? The one difference is you're emphasizing more your past research, which may or may not be related to what you're planning to do in the future. But in general, you do have to talk about the future. This is a very important thing. Some people write these research statements very heavily focused on what they have been doing and what they are doing. Very important to have that future part in there because that's a very important part of the assessment. They want to see what would you do if you come here. Right? So in that regard, it's kind of like a grant proposal, but definitely with much less detail on methods, and I'll reinforce that in a second. It is basically your research seminar. When you're invited, let's say for example you make that short list of interviewees and you have to do a research seminar, that basically is your research statement, just made into an oral version, right? I mean, it's basically that's what you go to do. You go to present, this is the research I've done. You may have some aspects that you choose not to put in your seminar, but basically it's the same sort of thing. Also, after you get the faculty position 5 or 6 years in, it will be part of your tenure package. It'll be the same sort of thing where you talk about the research you did, you talk about what you have in progress, and talk about what you're planning to do. And then here at Duke, they call that the intellectual development statement. It's kind of funny thing to do. It is basically the same sort of thing. So these are the kinds of things people usually ask. And I think these are very, very basic questions, so I'm just going to speed through those. So in terms of length, how big should you be shooting for? I say aim for 3 pages. And I say aim, I don't mean that's an absolute, it's 3.5, it's fine, it's 4, it's fine. If it's 7, that's way too long. Right? So I'd aim for about 3 pages, not including references. You can have a separate page of references at the end. And you should, by the way, I'll emphasize this again in a second, you should cite your own work in your research statement. By the way, for those of you who just walked in, all these slides are online, and I'll present at the very end the link which shows where you can download all the slides for. So don't feel like you have to copy any of this stuff. Okay? In terms of specificity, now this is going to be adjusted based on your institution and your likely readers, right? Again, I'll use the example of the College of William and Mary where I was an undergrad. If you apply for an ecology position there, odds are no ecologists are reading that job application because they only have one ecologist, right? So, in that sense, you have to write it such that a developmental biologist and a physiologist and a geneticist could actually read and understand actually what it was you were doing. In contrast, if you're applying to Duke, we have tons of ecologists. It's very likely a lot of specialists will be looking this over and they will know some of the terminology, these kinds of things. So you really have to tailor based on where you're going, based on who the faculty are that are there, how you present your research. And that's a very important aspect to it. Do emphasize the questions you're addressing. This is a very important facet. A lot of people go into, well, I decided to look into blah, blah, blah. They just dive right in. People don't know what the big questions are in your field. Even if they're in the same field, they may not anticipate the same sorts of questions that you anticipate as being really important. So it's really important to emphasize, here are the questions. Related to that is what conceptual advances has your work, your individual work done? Before, we didn't understand blah, blah, blah. Based on my results, we now know blah, 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 blah. So that's very important because that's showing that this was your contribution to science, right? Your contribution is not, just that line on your CV that has the nature at the end, but your contribution was the science that was within that thing that has the word nature at the end. That's a very important aspect of it. One thing not to do is go into experimental details. A lot of people spend way too much time on methods. Nobody cares that much about the methods. You just have like a clause or a sentence or something like that. If you do something that was really innovative and unique, if you took some approach that nobody's ever taken before, maybe you can elaborate on that. If it's something that a lot of people do, just barely mention what it is. Don't worry about details. Okay? And this is a little bit of generalities here. It's going to be much more specific for each of your individual situations. So here's a general writing approach for each paragraph. And this is, and I'll show you the more general format in just a second, but this is specifics for a particular paragraph. So let's say you're talking about, I'm talking about project X that I've been working on. So you would start, of course, with the big picture sentence on importance. Right? So the example I have here, and these examples, by the way, do not link to each other, as you'll see very quickly. The first one, netrin proteins guide neuronal development, and many neural diseases are associated with defects in netrin signaling. Okay? So this would be for some developmental biologists, actually the person I share lab space with, Dave Sherwood, works on netrin signaling. That's where I stole that from, but not from his application. This is just a big sentence on importance. Because, I personally never even heard of netrin proteins before. So if he just started going into me about netrin signaling, I'd be like, I don't know what that means. What is netrin? Oh, it's a protein. Oh, okay. What does it do? Basically, you have to set it up for why, what is it you're doing and why is it important, and use some words there to add to it. For example, the word proteins I added, it wasn't actually the paper I took it from, because I was just like, I don't know what netrin is. Some molecule, I guess. So you start off with your sort of big picture sentences on importance. It doesn't have to be one sentence. I just use it as an example. Second, you have to emphasize what is not known, right? Because your big picture sort of assumes that this is really important, so probably people know about it. Your second sentence has to emphasize what's not known. Obviously, again, this doesn't link to the one before it. However, we do not know the relative roles of global warming versus direct human contact in the spread of chytrid fungi. Those are the ones, by the way, if you remember, those are the ones that are killing off the world's amphibians. So maybe if you were researching the world's amphibians, this would be I'm trying to understand why this is spreading around, why it's killing off everything, right? But not known is how it's spreading. Maybe that is known, I just made that sentence up. Okay, does that make sense? All right.
It's either like you can say that it's not known, but can we also put it like it's important to know?
Yeah, that's fine. You can word it differently. But just emphasizing that we don't already know in some way. Yeah, you can say it would be very useful to know, which implies that we don't know.
Yeah. I sometimes see a lot of one, and it's like they put much like this is not known, this known, and sound like that guy really know nothing about it.
Well, no, but the point. So that's a very good question. So the question is, like, when I say it's not known, hopefully the next two sentences actually fix that word. Now we know. So sentence on what you did. So to test for the role of natural selection, again, this doesn't link with either two above it. To test for the role of natural selection on gene duplicates, I compared relative rates of non-synonymous sequence evolution of duplicated versus non-duplicated genes genome-wide among 12 sequenced Drosophila species. That is all I'm going to say about methods. Right? Because nobody wants to hear any more detail than that. If they want to hear more detail than that, you have a reference at the end. They can go pull up the paper and read that. But don't go into way too much detail. Right? So just keep that as brief as possible. And the most important parts I couldn't fit on the slide are basically some sentences on what you found and what you concluded. By observing X, I am able to conclude Y, and that helps basically address what the part is that's not known. Right, so now we know something that we didn't know before. Okay? This, by the way, is a general strategy for like whenever you're writing any sort of grant proposal or things like that. You always have to do this sort of general structure, except instead of sentences, it would be like pages or something like that. Okay? So in terms of formats, and I've talked to you there in a very specific context about a paragraph, but there's many possible just general formats for how to lay out the whole document. Right? And there's a lot of different opinions. In fact, actually, I showed this slide to somebody else that completely disagreed with my opinion. So take it with a grain of salt there. One thing I definitely encourage everybody to do is ask new assistant professors in your areas for their research statements. Because those are the people who are just successful, right? They're the people who just got the kinds of jobs that you want if they're an assistant professor in your area. General and common elements that I mentioned before is that sort of general intro with the broadest significance, what's not known, and what your personal goals and general approaches are. That last part I hadn't mentioned before. The general goals and general approaches. So this is for that executive summary I mentioned at the very top. Right? So this is not now your very specific experiments. And then you come back at the very end to significance. But let's talk about what's in the middle. This is probably the most common format. I hate it. This is probably the most common one, though. You have this executive summary paragraph, which is fine. You have your graduate research project by project. Project 1 was to do blah, 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 blah. I found blah, 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 blah. Postdoc research project by project. Project 1, blah, blah, blah. Post research. In the future, I'll do this. The thing is, nobody cares what order you did things. Right? That doesn't matter. But this is what almost everybody does. The other thing is it's not necessarily highlighting your best. What if your postdoctoral research is way more exciting than your graduate research? Do you have it buried there and like starts at page 3 at the top or maybe second paragraph in? No. I really don't think this is a good way of doing it personally, even though this is probably the most common way of doing it. Some people like this approach. I'm a little iffy on it. The modified grant proposal. Basically to format your research statement as though it were almost a grant proposal. Okay? So yeah, they obviously you have a lot more in the context of what you did in the past. Now there's advantages to this because it emphasizes your potential. It's very forward-looking. I can appreciate that. That's good. It does double duty. When I say double duty, I mean that you can actually copy a lot of this and use it for your actual grant proposal. So that, there's some time savings there. The disadvantage is really too focused on the present and future. I think that is a very important piece, but you do have to emphasize where you've already been successful. And that, I think, gets de-emphasized from this general format. The other thing is it's often way too detailed. Like, you're actually writing something as a grant proposal, you're really going to go into the nitty-gritty of grants, right? That's probably the second most common reason grants to get declined is because people say, well, you didn't consider this alternative outcome or things like that. There's nobody who will say that for your research statement as you're submitting to a university. It's not really that specific. If you choose to go this route, I'm not saying not to go this route, if you choose to go this route, think in the context of a general audience. When you submit a grant proposal, it's going to people who are pretty close to specialists, right? In this case, again, you may be a developmental biologist and this is being read by ecologists and biochemists. Right? So think in the context of general audience. They're not interested in minutia and sell much more hardware you've already done. But I would very much emphasize if you're going to do this, to do it with caution. Okay. Any questions on that? Going through this pretty quick. Yeah?
Why should we be cautious about that? What's the thing that we need to be cautious about?
So, making sure to do those last two things.
Oh, yeah.
The last thing, this is the one I'd advocate, basically, the flow of ideas or projects. This is probably the second most common format. I like this format much more than the other one. Basically here, instead of your major divisions being past, present, and future, your major divisions instead reflect problems or projects or basically like trains of thought. So you elaborate on the flow of work by concept. So I did this set of projects and here's the outcome from that. The outcome from this led me to decide in my postdoc to actually pursue this related project. And here's what I'm doing there, and this is what I found so far. This is making me think maybe a really good direction to do in the future will be this, because that'll answer this important problem. And so all those sort of thread together on one train of thought. And then the next part might be a whole different train of thought, where maybe some of it was just postdoc or some of it was just graduate. But I like a lot of things about this. First, it's emphasizing sort of problems rather than time, which is, nobody cares about time. People do care about problems. Second, it shows that your work is interconnected. Right? It shows that what you've done in the past is connected to what you're doing now, is connected to what you're doing in the future. Whereas the first format I showed you there has those as completely disconnected. Like, you'd have to go back and read, like, was this at all relevant to what they did before? Yes or no? This is much more flow. Yeah?
So what do you suggest then for people who had a PhD that was pretty different?
Great question. So if there really is absolutely no connection, then, I mean, you can do this as much as you can, but obviously it's going to be similar to the first one. However, what you can do then is you can choose, that was the third point, you can choose what you want to be first. You can start with your most exciting area. So if, let's say, for example, your postdoc research is way hotter and way more connected with what you're going to do, that would go into that now thinking why idea going to planned work, then you can put that first and it just grabs people rather than having that starting in page 2.5 or something like that. Does that answer your question? Good, okay. And again, I'd start with your most exciting area, especially if you made a lot of headway. Like, I wouldn't start with the most exciting area when you had like no progress on it at all. At that point, I might make that number 2 or something like that. Make sure you actually have done something in that context already published on it. And cite your pubs. The other thing too with these in general, show some figures. People get these things and it's just like this, wall of text, right? It's nice to have a couple of figures. I mean, don't go crazy, but have, like 1 or 2 figures in there just to break it up a little bit. Okay? General formatting thing, I always suggest, if you can, if it doesn't make it crazy long, double space between paragraphs. Just in general, that makes everything so much easier to read. Okay? Double space between paragraphs. Yeah?
Should the figures be included in the total page count and say you aim for 3 pages? Does that include figures?
Again, the 3 is very dodgy there. It's just, that's just a goal. If, adding a figure makes it go to 3.5, fine. Now, I wouldn't put the figure at the end. I'd integrate it with the text like where you're discussing it. So that way the person doesn't have to flip back and flip forward. Because again, they're going through this at rocket speed and underslept and, and everything else. The last thing too is end, and I mentioned this before, at the end with your significance and prospects. Come back to what the big picture is and your future directions. Even if you already emphasize that in the beginning and in some of the middle sections, because people will forget. They're going to read it, and somebody knocks on their door, and then it's like, oh yeah, and they're reading some more, then phone rings. I mean, typical a day, right? So round it out and come back to significance at the end. So here's an example of just how it might look. And I put it in very general terms. So here's your top part. This is actually my area. So speciation is the origin of all biodiversity. And despite 50 years of research, we still don't know fundamental elements like ABC, which wouldn't be ABC. Go ahead. My research program is uniquely suited to filling this void because of DEF. So, innovative approaches or integrative aspects to it. Something, emphasizing why you're good. We'll come back to this on the specific questions to ask yourself in just a second. Have subtitles for those general areas. So integrative approaches to understanding genetics of hybrid sterility. That might be one, and maybe a second one would be the integrative approach to understanding genetics of mate discrimination or something like that. So this would be a running theme. Initially, I used high-resolution QTL mapping. That was my full methods. So localized genes associated with hybrid sterility with the surprising result that, gee, you're an old fart in 2009. Right? This means emphasizing. You can actually, I have that bold there. You actually can bold it if you want. So again, they're scanning through this at rocket speed. More recently, this is probably a new paragraph. More recently, I've switched systems to be able to leverage the proteomic approach is better. I'm using K approach, and I found H, you're a slightly younger fart in 2011. Right? This proves blah, blah, blah. Continuing again that same line of thought. Given H, upon securing faculty position, I will build on this by doing I to test J. Super exciting hypothesis. This is feasible because, obviously, like, all this is sort of silly in some level, but these are the kinds of things that you want in there. That basically, what are they looking for? They're looking for, you had surprising results that have changed our understanding. You have a line of research. You can see connections more. And you can, sometimes even if you have, your past research is pretty different from your present, there are sometimes some threads that you can maybe, they may be kind of weak threads, but there's something like, okay, given my success with this, I decided to switch systems entirely, but study kind of the same thing and blah, blah, blah. You can draw those sorts of threads in this way, which is really nice. And that's the kind of thing that you'll want to do again with your research seminar. So you want to go? No. So this gives you just a general flow. And then imagine other subsections like that for other topics. Okay? So again, just to reemphasize some of these points, and I'll come back to the specific questions in a minute after the sell yourself. So highlight your best findings and promising breakthroughs. Think about what you've done, right? What are 2 to 3 conceptual insights that your research has provided? And think broadly, don't think very specific. Don't think, I know that under this set of conditions, blah, 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 blah will happen when blah, no. Big picture things. We now have a better understanding of blah because we've seen a demonstration of, so think sort of big picture. And this is a conceptual insight that changes your view within developmental biology, within cell biology, within ecology, within evolution, things like that. The other thing is related to that, what 1 or 2 conceptual insights might your planned future directions lead to? These are things that they're going to be wanting to pull out of that. These should be things that they can easily observe and extract from the text. It shouldn't be like buried in the middle of a sentence on page 2.5. Okay? All right. Selling yourself. Again, this is the part that I can't overstress, but it's hard to spend a lot of time just saying sell yourself over and over again. So we kind of brief in that context. This obviously needs to happen. You may be thinking, well, my advisor is going to do this, right? Because they're writing the letter writers. Well, the letter writers are going to be very variable in detail, especially that third letter writer, right? You typically have your graduate advisor, your postdoc advisor, and number 3. Number 3 never really knows what to write. They're always kind of at a loss, like, oh, no, okay. They're going to be very variable in detail. The other thing is the people who are actually evaluating your application, they're not going to dig through your papers to figure out the impact. They're going to rely on you to tell them. And you can actually be much more bold in your research statement than you can be in papers. Right? Papers tend to be overly cautious because of peer review. You can say, in your research statement, don't lie, obviously. But in your research statement, you can say something much bolder that reviewers would be like, oh, you have to put 16 disclaimers after this. Yeah, in your research statement, you can get rid of disclaimers. You can even put but C inside your paper or something. Yeah?
Is it okay to suggest to your letter writers politely what to put in the letter?
Absolutely. That's a very good question. The question is, can you suggest to your letter writers what to put in there? Absolutely. They would probably love it. In fact, actually, when you become a faculty member, you nearly always write your own recommendation letters for yourself. That sounds really weird, I know, but it nearly always happens. Where you'll ask somebody for a letter for something like, okay, just write it and send it to me and I'll sign it. It happens almost all the time. So be prepared for that. So again, be bold. It's up to you to be doing this. But at the same time, remember that non-specialists are reading. Even if you're applying here at ecology, which there's a lot of ecologists here, there's still going to be a lot of people who are not ecologists who are going to be reading it, right? The other thing is, again, mention these direct outcomes. And I know I'm making the same points over and over again, but I want to really stress them. What are the changes in dogma or belief? What are the resolutions to long-standing broad questions? What are highlights of your research by others? Right? That would be something you can mention. For example, if you were highlighted in, say, the faculty 1,000, tell them. They're not going to go do search it. They're not going to go search and find out. If some review paper made a big deal about your insights, cite that review paper in the context of your research statement. Say, as highlighted by a blah, this changes the way blah 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 was perceived. Right? It's very useful because they're not going to find it. And of course, identify future possibilities that are opened by your research that weren't available before. Any questions? I know I talk a little fast. I'm sorry. Just get excited. So this is an aside. This is actually completely external to what I'm supposed to be talking about, but I want to just toss this in there. So here's the 3 letters I mentioned before, and that third one's always the wild card. Something to think about. Somebody advised this to me, and I think this is a good idea. So think about getting an external review letter for your job application. So let's say, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I will write to person X, who's also an evolutionary biologist, but with whom I've never ever worked. Right? I've never had any direct connection. Maybe they've cited some of my papers, actually preferably they have, so they at least know something I've said. But have them write a letter, and basically what this does is this highlights the impact of your work from people who are not at all biased. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time when you're going up for tenure. It doesn't happen as much when you're applying for jobs, but it definitely really highlights, especially if it's somebody who's fairly known and respectable in the field. And they're saying, this work really is transformative. I would hire them here if there was a job opening here. That really carries a lot of weight. And to some extent, that may carry more weight than the letters from your PhD and postdoc advisors, because it really suggests what the impact of the work is by somebody in the field. Is there a question?
Oh no, I just have. How about like reference letter that is like, for example, I'll say, like faculty member where where I have been in touch with for like 10 years, and then he has become a very senior, and then I've been in touch with him for the past 10 years about my research. So would that be like considered?
That would be similar. I mean, I think the best is somebody who you've had basically no direct. I mean, somebody who maybe you've talked to at meetings, but you've had no like direct collaborations with or things like that. Now, these are just some examples. Now, I should emphasize, anybody who's applying for, say, a purely teaching position, you should definitely get letter writers from people who have observed you teaching, for example. So this is just a sample set for if you're applying for research-oriented jobs.
And also, how do I know the strength of because like the top 3 apparently is, it should be pretty strong, right? Otherwise, then, you should not even apply. But the last one, you don't really know like how strong that is going to be.
No, it's true. You don't? No, it's true.
Okay. No.
Yeah. What you do is, if you pick somebody who's cited you several times positively, you can assume it will probably be at least positive.
Okay.
So that's it. But there is, I mean, that's part of why it carries so much weight. So the question was, how do we know that letter's going to be really strong? That's part of why it carries so much weight, because you don't know. You don't know if it will or not. The hope is that it will, especially if you pick somebody who cited you several times favorably, then the hope is that it will. But that's why it carries so much weight, because it's not one. I mean, basically, the first 3 letters, to be perfectly blunt, I think we could just throw those out. Because all of them come back, this person's the best person, blah, 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 blah. Every one of them says that, except for the third one who's always kind of lost. Right? So those kind of are useless. Whereas that last one, I think that's actually the useful letter that goes in there. Okay. So questions to ask yourself. This is probably the longest section. So first, is the research fundable and sustainable? These are the questions. Now, I'm saying these are questions to ask yourself, but these are the questions that basically they will be thinking in the context of your applications, right? Is this research fundable and sustainable? How much money do you need to do this? What kind of funding is available? Can you tap into both NIH and NSF, or are you stuck with just NSF? Or worse yet, are you stuck with just private foundations and things like that? Is it broad enough to secure funding, or is it really, really, really specialized where like I don't see anybody funding it just because it's so specific? Are there applied components? Can you tap into like money from industry or contracts or things like that? All those things will really strengthen if you put it in the broadest sense possible. Okay. Is the research appropriate for the university to which you're applying? Do you need a sequencer like that? When I'm sitting there beside, I just took that picture of the summer. It was great. If you're applying to the College of William and Mary and you need one of those, good luck. They don't have one, and they're probably not going to give you enough startup to buy one. So basically, the facilities infrastructure needed at the university for you to execute the research you're talking about. If the answer is no, then you have to modify what you're proposing or don't bother applying. Right? Because if they say that there's no way you can get hired, then it's not going to work. For example, in biology here, several people in the past have been criticized in the application stage because they're working with mouse models. The biology right in the med school is perfectly set up for having big mouse colonies and things like that. Biology department, we're really not. We have no idea what you'd do if you came in and you wanted to work with mice. We don't have a facility set up for that. So that's been something that's been used to criticize some candidates several times in the past. Does it match university priorities? Again, is this a primarily undergraduate institution? And is your research amenable to undergrads? Do you specifically mention you can involve undergrads? That's a very important thing at some universities, less so at others. If you're applying to UCSF, since they don't even have undergrads, they're not going to care, right? Whereas if you're applying to, again, William & Mary, they're going to very much want to see that. That's going to be a very big part of what they're doing. And there you have to make sure it's all amenable to undergrads and master's students, because that's all there are. Yeah?
So for an outsider who maybe wouldn't know the proximity or the integration between the medical center and the biology department, how would they know, should they contact someone?
That's a good question. If you need something that's pretty tough, that would be the kind of question that would be worth going ahead and dropping to the search committee. You can say, I work on mice, and I know those are, for example, with working on flies, I can just put them on a counter and they'd be fine. And so I wouldn't need to write and ask them that sort of question. But if somebody did work, say, on mice or needed some really specialized stuff, that probably is worth a quick email to the search committee, just saying, is this feasible? Yeah, and if so, can you think of how it is? Because I don't want to waste your time and my time. And I mean, they'll appreciate that too, because I mean, you don't want to waste their time either. Good question. Others? Good. How is it distinct from my advisors? This comes up especially with people's first grants, but that's why, to some extent, the search committees will be looking at that. Now, when I talk about this, I'm talking about your future research. Now, obviously, your present your research in your postdoc probably isn't fully distinct from your postdoctoral advisors, since they're obviously doing it with you, or at least involved in it. But the future research you're basically proposing to do exactly the kind of research that your postdoc advisor does, in the sense you'll actually be competing with them for grants. That's not a good idea. They're set up, they're successful, that's probably why you went to their lab. You are going to be not set up, and we're trying to compete with them. That's not a good idea. Generally, very much not a good idea to come with your advisors. It's good to emphasize what projects can come with you. If you have a project that will be continuing, emphasize that, and this is definitely a case, this comes back to Molly's question earlier, this is the case where you ask your postdoc advisor, your PhD advisor, to write in their letter, this project can come with person X and we will not continue to pursue it. So it's very clear that this is your line of research and not their line of research. So I've had, for example, in my lab, I've had some postdocs who came through actually with their own line of research. I wrote that specifically in their letter saying, you know, person X brought this into the lab and when she leaves to start her faculty position, it will go with her, it is hers. Okay, so that's something that's very useful to have that emphasized. The last part is also important. This is again something that a lot of starting grants get dinged for. Is the scale appropriate for a starting lab? Are you proposing something that needs like an army of people, and especially an army of, say, postdocs or something like that to do it? If so, you're not going to have an army of postdocs day one. It's going to take you a long time to ramp up. So it has to be something where the scale, at least for the short term, is appropriate. You can emphasize, you know, in the very long term, I hope to do blah, but you know, make it very clear that you understand that you're not day two going to be as big a lab as your postdoc advisor's lab. Do you have a question? No? All right. What is that? Basically, what uniquely suits me to do this research? Any attributes or any experience or any tools? What makes it so you can do this research better than somebody else can do? And specifically you there, you at institution X. Why would that be a good place for that research to be done? Right? Now, let's say, for example, place X has some unique resource, and you have some unique set of skills, and those two things go together. That's the ideal scenario, right? Unique resource plus unique set of skills means this research can be done better there than any place else. That's outstanding. Are there approaches that you're using for which you have a lot of experience and you can apply in a new sort of integrative way or innovative way? And are there connections to other research programs there? Like, are you going to collaborate with some people there, do you think? And you don't have to, you don't say, I'm going to collaborate with person X to do this, because Professor X, if they haven't agreed to that, you're like, I didn't agree to this. You could just say, I would be interested in developing projects with your other developmental biologist or cell biologist, things like that, in the general area of blah, and I see that lab so-and-so is doing blah, blah, blah. You can leave it that general. I wouldn't go any more specific than that, though, because you don't want them to be like, I never agreed to this, and getting mad at you. Yeah. Thoughts? And the last part, second one. Are the questions good? This sort of seems like an obvious one, right? You don't want to ask bad questions, right? But what does good mean? Well, good means a big question is interesting to a wide cross-section of the broader field. If your question is so incredibly focused, I want to know why slugs turn left when in the presence of W. No, nobody cares about that. It has to be something that's really broad, like I'm trying to understand the role of Ventrin signaling or natural selection, something that really puts it into a broader context. Second one's a big one. Can a question actually be answered? This is the kind of thing that everybody's been writing in their grant proposal for 40 years and nobody's ever come close to answering because it's not really answerable. If that's the case, word it differently. Don't put it like that. Figure out what specific thing you actually can get an answer to. Are there specific outcomes that can be focused on impact but not overly focused? That sort of relates back to the top one. And this last one, this is a good question just in general to ask yourself about your research. If we get these data points, is there new understanding or just a few more data points? There's unfortunately a lot of research which ends up being the latter part. Right? Just more data points. And it's like, okay, now we have this after 4 more years of work. No particular more understanding. We now, instead of having 9 examples of blah, we have 11. Okay. At some level, you could say that is useful because in the long term, yes, now we're up to 11, but someday we'll be at 50. It's kind of useful, but this is the kind of question you really ask yourself in general. Is just, what new understanding is coming out of all this stuff? And this is one of the last parts here. Are my approaches the most appropriate and not just what I've always done? A lot of people are sort of one-trick ponies, right? I've forever been doing, restriction digests of blah, blah, blah. Well, that's, very 1990s or 1980s, whatever. So make sure you're using the current impactful approaches. And don't, I say this with a little bit of hesitation, essentially. Don't be lured in by fads. Like, ooh, everybody's doing RNA-seq, so I'm going to do that too. Make sure that is appropriate for what you want to be doing. It's not just a fad, but you want to actually do it for some reason. But think deeply whether there's a better way. What you don't want to do is, especially as a new faculty member, if you sound at all sort of old-fashioned, like, well, people were doing that a long time ago, and there's better ways to do it, and they're not proposing to do it and not giving a reason why they're not doing it, that's really going to reflect poorly on your application. Okay? So a little bit of pie in the sky, as the picture shows there, is okay. In general, just think in the context, you'll need to reinvent yourself to stay competitive. You can't always be doing exactly what you're doing. Your research program will evolve. Natural selection is important. So this is an outline of what we've gone over today. I'll take some questions in just a second, but let me just show one final word here. This is probably one of the most important things I can say. Proofread yourself lots. Read it. I mean, the worst thing if you send something in that's like got grammatical errors and typos and stuff, like, what? Is this not important enough? It's a job application where you're competing with 500 people? Like, okay, what comes above that? Have someone with whom you work proofread. Have your graduate advisor, postdoc advisor, lab mates, things like that. But very importantly, number 3 there, have someone from an unrelated lab proofread. That, I mean, it's just as in general too, for like grant proposals too. People always have the person next to them read it. They read it, but they read it knowing exactly what you did before they even picked up that piece of paper, right? So they can read between the lines, they can fill in any gaps immediately and even unconsciously. If you get somebody who's in a completely different lab to look at them and they're like, I'm completely lost, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't know what this means, I don't know what this means. That will really be helpful feedback for you. Look at somebody who's not in the same lab, not even in a related lab to it. Because this document represents you. Okay? So, with that, I thank you. I'm happy to take several questions and acknowledge, of course, Postdoc Services Grad School and Career Center. And here's that link I promised in the beginning. So, happy to take your questions. Yeah?
So you mentioned ask the new assistant professor for their package.
Yes.
But do you mean ask your institution, not the one place you?
No, don't write to them too. That'd be a little awkward. At the institution where you are currently present. The other thing is, it doesn't have to be the institution you're currently present. But if, let's say, for example, you're here, but you're applying to Cedar Crest College or something like that, which is primarily a teaching institution. If you have a friend who got a job at a similar institution, you can do that. I wouldn't write to just some random person you've never heard of who's at Cedar Crest College and ask them to write you write what their application package was. But yeah, something either where you are or at a similar institution to the ones to which you're applying. Basically, look at recently successful ones is what you're looking for. Good question.
But the expectation could be different from the ones put together.
Well, if it's the same sort of, if it's a primarily teaching position, it's going to be pretty similar. If it's primarily research position, it's going to be pretty similar. Now, the specifics are going to be very different. These are going to be very personal. And for example, the formats I showed you, those are just ones that I came up with off the top of my head. Some people suggest very different things. One that I just thought of, I only thought of this just yesterday, so I didn't put it in the talk. One I thought of yesterday is basically something where remember I said that thing, what are your top concepts, top 3 things you write? Maybe just having a list of those at the end or something like that. Top 3 things I found, 1, 2, 3. I don't know if that's a crazy, like I said, I haven't given that too much thought yet, but it just occurred to me in a different context yesterday. I wonder if that would be useful in a job application package, just to, there you go, this is what I've done, and not in the context of paper numbers and placements and things like that.
Maybe in a cover letter or something?
Maybe in a cover letter, that might be a good thing to do. Yeah, again, like I said, I haven't given that too much thought at all, I just thought that's what I did put in the talk. Yeah?
One more question?
Sure.
So you said, you did mention, like, say, why their location is the best fit for you to continue your study there. But, I mean, you have to apply for another place as well, and then you have to say like similar things. Like
that's why I didn't mention that, because I mean, to some extent, those sometimes come off a little forced. If it's really, really true, if someplace really is your top choice and there's a reason why it's your top choice, I'd go ahead and put that. I would put it in the cover letter. I wouldn't necessarily put it in the research statement. If let's say you're applying to 40 places, and the ones that are not in your top 2 or 3, I wouldn't try to say this is the best place for me to be. I mean, I wouldn't put anything like that, because you don't want a lot. Right? it'll be transparent if you do. Yeah.
You see a lot on job ads. They're looking for research programs that complement strengthens of the department. Can you elaborate on that?
So that's a good question. The question was, a lot of job ads will say we're looking for somebody who complements existing areas in using ecology as an example. Say complements our existing area in quantitative ecology or something like that. So what you do then is you could actually have, basically you can use mostly the same statement as you'd use for another similar caliber university, but then I'd put an extra paragraph in there saying, I feel that my research specifically complements your existing strength and quantitative ecology, while Professor X uses Y and Z approaches, I use A and B approaches, and it would be a nice fit where maybe we could work together and use these things in conjunction, and the basically greater than the sum of the parts. You know, you could put something like that in there, but I wouldn't reframe the entire thing around that sort of statement, because often those things are very political within the department, the reason it says this exact way, things like that. And maybe not everybody else in the department actually buys into that particular verbiage. But I put a little bit, if there's something specific like that in a job ad, then it's worth putting just a quick thing, just noting that, noting integration.
Could be at the point to discourage you from applying to that particular place. For example, you have an overlapping.
If you overlap, I mean, it's very unlikely you're going to overlap so much that you have nothing new to offer relative to the person who is there to. So I try to emphasize, if you had something like that, you know, what you do that's distinct. You know, you can say, you know, I've done a lot of QTL mapping. I think I collaborate with this person on it who also does QTL mapping. However, I've also done, you know, a lot of transcriptome work, which that person hasn't. Or don't say which that person hasn't, but just imply there. However, I've also done this, and I think that would be complementary to what strengths already exist within your department. That make sense? Yeah.
What's the best way to cite work that's either in progress or just recently submitted, either in the CV or the research statement? Great question. So you can, in your research statement, it's totally fine to just cite something as even like in prep or something like that. In your CV, I never put in prep. In prep is like fictional. I mean, I have tons of nature papers in prep. So I would never put that. In review is totally valid. I mean, there's no problem with putting that. You can just put submitted or something like that on there. So that you can put both in your CV and in your research statement. Now, for the work that's actually in prep, you can cite it in your research statement, but I mean, you're describing it anyway, so there's no particular advantage of putting just a title on it. You can just describe it and not actually have a citation to it there. So there's not a particular advantage to in prep in general, I don't think. The one exception to that I would encourage those is people who are still in graduate school and haven't necessarily published on anything. There, I think it's okay to go ahead and put in prep. But I mean, those are, especially if you're already a postdoc, I just in preps. Yeah.
So about the strategical, is that the same way that you approach it today, what you said previously, that you want to have a look at it, know what is going on, but don't just stick to it because people in that department might not even agree to it?
Oh, you mean in terms of like the emphases part? Yeah, because often, so the ads will often say this, we're especially interested in blah, blah, blah. Yeah. That we may or may not be the whole department. Oh. That we may be a very small subset of the department who insisted that verbiage get added to the ad. Now, probably the rest of the department isn't going to be hostile to that, but don't feel like, oh, I can't apply because I don't have the special interest part. You know, that again, especially if your record's really strong, you know, they may very well be interested in you, or there may be something they just honestly just didn't even think of. They'd be like, oh, well, yeah, we could actually totally use that. It didn't come up in our deliberations, but that would be something great.
So another question is, apparently you want to tie in your research statement to what others doing in the same department.
If it specifically says that, I mean, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it because it gets a little forced if you do too much of that. Okay. But if it's natural or if the ad asks for it, you can do a little bit of that. But I wouldn't go crazy far with that. Okay. Yeah. Other questions? 8 minutes. Yeah.
If instead of a research statement, the job only asks for an application letter in which that's a part of it, you know, research and teaching in 2 pages, then, you know, do you prioritize the big concepts and the big questions, or it's sort of a challenge because you want to give an overview, but it's very brief.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, at that point, I guess the big thing to do would be the big challenges and the feasibility. Because I mean, probably for institutions that usually say that, those are usually ones that are primarily undergraduate oriented, things like that. I would emphasize the feasibility of doing it there and the involvement of students. Basically, the integration of research and teaching in that sort of context. Right? That you'll be mentoring these undergraduates that they can help pursue this kind of research. So I would definitely emphasize those kinds of things. By the way, I should emphasize everything I've said here is totally my opinion, so it's worth as much as it costs. Yeah.
As far as teaching goes, if you have just been a research scientist as a graduate and postdoc and don't have teaching experience or haven't had that, what are you supposed to include in that type of a document?
In the research, in the teaching statement?
In something like that.
Yeah, usually, well, I mean, there was that other talk on that, but I mean, typically in that sense, no, that's okay. I didn't give it, so I don't even know what they said. Typically, that's what I think you talk about, like what you'd want to teach and how you would teach it and things like that. Now, if you have absolutely no teaching experience, then it's obviously going to be kind of hard to write. But what you can try to do as much as possible is like think about what influenced you and what are good, you know, pedagogical techniques that you think you could apply. But at that point, it's all forward-looking. Yeah.
In a research-oriented position, if you get that position, there most likely is some teaching involved at some point in the future.
Mostly, yeah.
So is any teaching experience, can that give you a little edge or
It's going to be very institution by institution and department by department specific. So the question is basically then, how much does teaching experience pay in for you're getting a job at a primarily research institution? It's going to be very, very specific by situation. I mean, obviously there are people who get jobs at research universities who had no teaching experience whatsoever, or maybe TA'd one class as the requirement to take off for graduate school. If you're applying for a teaching oriented position, you won't get it. So it's not even worth applying at that point. But at research universities, I mean, there are some where that is taken into account. I mean, not so much the experience, but the thought that's put into, say, this teaching statement and the fit of what you would teach if you were to go there. So, for example, let's say that we're hiring actually the biology department right now is hiring a physiologist. If somebody writes a teaching statement and doesn't mention they're going to teach the physiology class and mentions all these like graduate level classes, that's all they want to teach, that would definitely reflect poorly upon their application and would lower their consideration level. Even though we are a research university, that is one of the things that our department does consider. So it's not, the experience there matters a little bit. More important is basically the intention in the future, at least here. But it's going to be very different department by department. Some places probably will look pretty heavily at actually how much they have done. So I thought I was hand up here earlier, but maybe not. Oh, yeah?
Is there necessary that we should include a reference list at the end? Or if I just like to say this work is publication in some well, so do I need to mention?
It depends on the ad. I mean, some of the things with these online things, when you fill it in, you actually put in the online form, these are who my 3 references will be. At that point, you don't have to bother putting it in the cover letter because it's in the online form, and they can ping those people if they never submit the letters. If they don't have something in the online form where you actually put in who the references are, it's probably worth it just because people suck about letters, and the people who are supposed to write letters often don't, not because they hate the person, but just because they just forgot and they're irresponsible. To be blunt. So in that sense, it's worth doing it. All right. Well, thanks, you guys.